The man studying the ancient artifacts was taking photos from angles that had nothing to do with appreciation. David Chen noticed it immediately, the way he photographed security camera positions, measured distances with his eyes, lingered near exit routes while pretending to admire Renaissance paintings. Most museum guides would have continued their tours and assumed he was just another enthusiastic visitor. But before David had spent 6 years leading tours at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, he'd spent 22 years as an art crimes investigator for Interpol, tracking stolen masterpieces through international black markets and preventing museum heists across 3 continents. The man in the navy blazer wasn't studying art. He was casing the museum. And David recognized the patterns because he'd spent 2 decades stopping people exactly like this from stealing cultural treasures worth millions. The question wasn't whether to report him. The question was whether David could identify what the thief was targeting before he returned with a team. David Chen, 61, had worked at the Met since 2017. After retiring from Interpol's art crime unit, he'd wanted to stay connected to the art world without the intensity of international investigations and constant travel. Museum Guide was perfect, sharing knowledge with curious visitors, surrounded by masterpieces, engaging with people who loved culture. His tours were popular, rated highly for his depth of knowledge and engaging storytelling. His background check showed international law enforcement, 1993 to 2015, and advanced degrees in art history. The hiring committee assumed he'd been some kind of cultural liaison. Nobody asked specifics about which international agency or what his law enforcement work involved. David didn't volunteer that he'd recovered over $200 million in stolen art, prevented dozens of museum thefts, and could spot art criminals the way some people recognize faces. Tuesday afternoon, 2:15 p.m. David was leading his Renaissance Masters Tour, 12 visitors, standard route through galleries 624 to 630. Most were listening attentively, taking photos of paintings, asking questions about techniques and symbolism. One man stood apart, early 40s, navy blazer, expensive watch, carrying a small notebook. He took photos, but not like typical tourists. His camera angles captured room layouts, emergency exits, security camera positions. He lingered at doorways, assessing sight lines. David had seen this behavior hundreds of times. Art thieves don't look like movie criminals. They look like wealthy collectors, art students, or enthusiastic tourists. But their reconnaissance patterns are distinctive to anyone trained to recognize them. The man photographed a 15th century manuscript, displayed in Gallery 626, but his lens captured the security case mechanism and nearby alarm sensors. He checked his watch 3 times in 5 minutes, timing guard rotations. David continued his tour professionally, but his Interpol training activated. He was now documenting physical description, clothing, behavior patterns, areas of interest. The man was professional, careful, methodical, experienced. During the tour's bathroom break, David stepped aside and made a call, not to museum security yet, but to a former colleague still with Interpol's art crime unit. "This is David Chen. I'm at the Met. I have a possible reconnaissance situation. Can you run a quick check for me?" He provided a detailed description. Within 3 minutes, his colleague called back. "David, that description matches Marco Santelli, Italian national, suspected involvement in 3 European museum thefts, never convicted, but flagged in multiple investigations. If he's at the Met, you have a problem. David returned to his tour, now watching Santelli with heightened attention. The man had moved to Gallery 628, photographing a small Byzantine reliquary, 12th century gold and precious stones, valued at $4.5 million. Not the museum's most famous piece, which meant it was smart targeting. High value, less security attention, easier to move on black market. Santelli made notes, checked his watch again, then walked toward the exit. He wasn't being suspicious enough to trigger security protocols, but to David's trained eye, this was textbook advance reconnaissance. David excused himself from the tour, handing the group to another guide with a practiced excuse about an urgent matter. He followed Santelli at a distance, using 20 years of surveillance experience to stay invisible. Santelli made one more pass through Gallery 628, this time photographing from different angles. He was building a complete tactical map of the space. David approached casually, tourist to tourist. Beautiful piece, isn't it? The Byzantine reliquary. Most people miss it because everyone's focused on the bigger galleries. Santelli smiled politely, but didn't engage. Yes, very beautiful. I'm actually a guide here, David continued conversationally. Worked in art authentication before this. Amazing how these pieces travel through history. Some have been stolen multiple times over centuries. Santelli's expression flickered, just for a moment, calculating whether this chatty guide was a problem or just enthusiastic. The security on these smaller pieces is quite sophisticated, David added, letting the statement hang in the air with just enough weight to be noticed. The museum upgraded everything after consulting with international law enforcement. Interpol Art Crime Unit, specifically. Santelli went still. That detail wasn't public knowledge. Only someone with inside knowledge would mention Interpol-specific involvement. You seem very knowledgeable, Santelli said carefully. 22 years with Interpol art crime, David replied quietly. Recovered over 200 million in stolen art. I know what reconnaissance looks like. I know what you're doing. And I know who you are, Mr. Santelli. The gallery suddenly felt very small. Santelli's professional facade cracked slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a tourist. You photographed security cameras, timed guard rotations, measured distances to exits, and focused on a high-value, lower-profile piece that's smart, targeting for black market sale. You're not a tourist. You're planning a theft. Santelli smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Prove it! I'm just taking photos. Everyone does. You're right. I can't prove criminal intent from photographs. David's voice remained calm. But I can alert museum security, who will review all your photos, document your presence, and share your description with every major museum in the United States. I can contact Interpol and let them know you're active in New York, and I can make sure that Reliquary has additional security protocols that make your plan impossible. You're retired, Santelli said, voice hardening. You have no authority. I don't need authority. I just need to make enough noise that your operation becomes too risky. Art theft works on planning and surprise. I just removed both. They stood facing each other for a long moment, two professionals who understood exactly what was happening. Enjoy your visit, Mr. Santelli, David said finally. I hope you find the museum educational. And I hope you understand that some of us never really retire from protecting cultural heritage. Santelli left the museum within 20 minutes. David immediately briefed museum security and filed a detailed report with both the Met's protection team and his former colleagues at Interpol. Enhanced security was placed on the Byzantine reliquary and several other high-value small pieces that matched the profile of Santelli's known interests. His photos from museum cameras were analyzed, confirming David's assessment. Every shot had been tactical reconnaissance. Interpol flagged Santelli's presence in New York to other major museums. Within a week, 3 institutions reported similar suspicious behavior from matching descriptions. A pattern of pre-operational surveillance across multiple cities. "David, you stopped this before it started," his former Interpol colleague told him. He would have hit one of those museums, probably within days. Your intervention shut down the entire operation. The Met's director personally thanked David. "We had no idea your background was so extensive. Why didn't you tell us you were Interpol?" "Because I wanted to be hired as a museum guide, not a security consultant. I love sharing art with people." "But protecting it?" He smiled. "That's muscle memory. Some instincts don't turn off." David Chen continues leading tours at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He still shares fascinating stories about Renaissance paintings, Byzantine reliquaries, and ancient artifacts. His tours remain highly rated for his passion and knowledge. The difference is that now museum security knows they have someone who can spot art criminals as easily as he can explain brushwork techniques. And international art crime units know there's a highly trained observer working the galleries, watching for threats most people would never recognize. Santelli was arrested 3 months later in Rome, attempting to sell stolen medieval manuscripts. The investigation traced his reconnaissance patterns across 12 museums in 6 countries. David's early identification and intervention had prevented at least 2 planned thefts. "You saved irreplaceable cultural treasures," an Interpol agent told him. "Pieces that belong to human history, not private collections." David simply replied, "That's always been the mission. The uniform doesn't matter, museum guide or Interpol agent. Protecting cultural heritage is protecting who we are as a civilization." Sometimes, the most effective security doesn't wear a uniform or carry a badge. Sometimes it's someone explaining Renaissance art, while simultaneously calculating security vulnerabilities and spotting criminal reconnaissance. And sometimes choosing retirement means continuing to serve, just in ways that blend seamlessly into everyday life. Have you ever realized someone working in culture or education had experience protecting it at the highest levels? Share their story, because expertise in preservation and protection often looks like simple appreciation. If this story reminded you that guardians work everywhere, subscribe to Life Stories Archive. Every quiet protector of cultural heritage deserves recognition.